Hello. Every year at Remembrance, we do what millions of others in this country and across the world do. Every year in these villages, our acts of remembrance look very similar. We don't change much in what we do because we gather to remember. We wear our poppies to remind us of the flowers that grew in the battlefields of the First World War, bringing hope even in the darkest of times. We remember those who lost their lives or their health, fighting in the First and Second World Wars and more recent conflicts. We stop and keep silence for 2 minutes to pay our respects, and we hope and pray that going forwards, things will be different, that there will be peace. Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States during the First World War, recognising the horror of war, described it as the war to end all wars. So appalled was he by the destruction and loss of life that he couldn't imagine humanity would ever allow such things to happen again. But as we all know, all too soon, more lives were being lost in the Second World War, and fighting has continued ever since. We may have always been aware of wars around the world, even wars that British troops were involved in. But this year, for the first time in decades, there has been war in Europe after Vladimir Putin ordered his troops to invade Ukraine. We are all aware of the lives lost and the suffering this has caused. This has meant that news of war has been more prominent in our lives over the past few months. But for most of us, we are still safe. We haven't had to worry about our safety or the safety of our loved ones. For some, though, that is their reality day after day, night after night. As we pause to remember this year, what will you think about during those 2 minutes silence? Will it be the 19-year-old Billy McFadzean of the Royal Irish Rifles? Billy was handing out a box of grenades in Thiepval Wood at the start of the Battle of the Somme. The box slipped out of his hands, and he instantly noticed that 2 grenade pins had become dislodged. Without any hesitation, he threw himself down on the box of grenades, muffling the blast. With this action, he saved his comrades. Only one other person was injured. But of course, in doing so, he sacrificed his life. He was awarded the Victoria Cross, which is Britain's highest award for bravery in the face of the enemy. Or you could remember Walter Tull. Before the First World War, he was breaking ground as an English professional footballer of Afro-Caribbean descent. He played as an inside forward and halfback for Clapton and then Tottenham Hotspur, before moving to Northampton Town. Like so many, Walter Tull had a harrowing time in the trenches in France, and he briefly returned to England in 1916 to recover from trench fever and shell shock. By 1917, however, he was back in France, having become an officer. He led his men with gallantry and coolness under fire. He was hugely admired and respected by those with him, and when he was shot at Arras in no man's land on the 25th of March 1918, the men risked their own lives to try to recover his body. Maybe you'll reflect on the civilian population of Ukraine, not fighting in an army, but casualties of war nonetheless. In recent weeks, a series of missiles were fired at Ukrainian cities. In Kyiv, there was a young female paediatric haematologist, Oksana Leontieva. She was hit as she drove home from her hospital night shift, where she had been caring for children with cancer. She had a 5-year-old son. 80 missiles were launched on Ukrainian cities that day, and she died. Maybe you'll think about someone you know who has served or is serving today in the British military. Maybe somebody you know who returned from war with mental or physical injury. I will think of all of those, including my own loved ones. But I'll also think of a story that Bishop John told us on last week's diocesan conference. A young man joined the army, and after some training, he was sent to the Falkland Islands to fight. During the 10-week war, 649 Argentine military personnel, 255 British military personnel, and 3 Falkland Islanders died. The man returned to the UK and stayed in the army, gradually working his way up through the ranks until he had quite a senior position. One day, as he was travelling through London, he climbed the steps to leave the tube station. As he emerged onto the street, he saw what looked like a bundle of clothes. Next to it was a sign that said, "Falklands Veteran." The man reached into his pocket and took out his wallet so he could give the beggar some money to get a hot drink. To his embarrassment, he realised that the only cash he had with him was a £50 note. There, but for the grace of God go I, he thought. So he screwed up the note in his hand, reached down and placed it in the hand of the beggar, and then squeezed his shoulder. When the beggar saw how much money he'd been given, he looked with surprise at the generous stranger. He looked down again at the money that was now his. Then he looked the stranger in the eye and said, with tears in his own eyes, "Muchas gracias, Señor." The soldier was also moved to tears, and they hugged. Once enemies, they became good friends. Where once they had fought each other, they now valued each other. I don't mind admitting that this story also brought a tear to my eye, because it is important to remember and honour the sacrifices made in the past. But it is also vital that we look to the future, that we reflect on what we can do to work for peace. Our gospel reading this week is about love. Jesus tells us quite simply to love one another. If we follow that command, if we love each other, there will be no more war. There will be no more fighting. If we love as Jesus said to love, loving others as God has loved us, then there will be unity instead of division, healing instead of broken relationship, forgiveness where enemies can become friends. As the prophet Micah wrote several thousand years ago, one day they will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. So as we remember this year, as we reflect, let's share in sorrow for the suffering that war has caused and continues to cause even today. And let us commit ourselves to work for peace, to love others as we have been loved, to work towards a world where no one learns war anymore. Amen.